In this tutorial, we are going to discuss how to find credible sources. When you have an assignment that requires you to find an article or a book to use as a source, you will need to ask yourself questions about what are going to be the most helpful sources for the job that you're trying to get done. First, we'll talk about clues that you should look for in the sources to make sure that they will be effective for your assignment. And then we're going to look at different types of sources that you might use for an assignment. When you're looking for sources, there's never going to be a rubber stamp on the source that tells you this is definitely a credible source for your paper. So what you need to do is ask critical questions along the way to make a decision about whether a source is good for the assignment that you're working on. You first need to think about questions of authority. Why should you trust this source rather than any other one that you find? You should ask questions about who the author is. What credentials do they have? Are they an expert in the field? Did they get a PhD on the topic? Do they teach at a university? Or have they written other articles and books about this topic? You can also look at where the article is published. Is it in an academic journal? Is it on a reputable website? And investigating some of these questions of authority helps you determine how much you can trust this source. You should also just ask yourself general questions about accuracy. And this is probably something that you do without even thinking about it. So as you're reading through a source, pay attention to whether there are a lot of typos or grammatical errors in the source, or whether there are a lot of obvious factual errors that you find in the source. This might indicate either that the author doesn't know what they're talking about, or that no one took the time to edit the source so that it was ready for publication. Next, you should think about how current the source is. When was this article or essay or book published? And how recent the publication needs to be really might depend on the assignment that you're doing. So this is something that you can check your syllabus for. Sometimes professors require that all articles that you find have been published in the last 5 to 10 years. And that's pretty typical for a field like counseling. So make sure that the source is recent. Because if it's an older source, there might be a more recent article available that gives you more recent research and information that can help you with your assignment. Next, you need to think about whether the source is relevant for the research question that you're asking. So if you are investigating something about like childhood development, you could find an article about that from a counseling perspective or an educational perspective or a sociological perspective, but you need to make sure that the article you find is asking the same sorts of questions that you are in the same way that you are for this assignment, because then you're going to find that they offer answers that are going to be the most helpful for the research that you're doing. Finally, you need to think about the objectivity or the purpose of the source that you find. You should be able to determine whether the article is making a policy recommendation or talking about best practices, or is the article just an empirical study or a quantitative study that just gives you information about original research that was done. Both of these types of sources might be helpful for your assignment, but you need to be able to identify what the article is being written for, and that's going to help you determine whether it's helpful for your assignment or not. These are 5 of the main categories of questions that I tend to ask when I'm looking at whether a source is credible, and you need to ask these for each source and continue to investigate, again, because there's not going to be any yes or no answer to whether a source is credible. It's going to depend on what sort of research you're doing, what kind of question you're asking, and sometimes what sorts of sources your professor wants you to find for the assignment. Now we're going to look at what types of sources you might be finding for your assignment. Because lots of sources might be credible, they might give good information, but they're not exactly what your professor is asking you to find. You might find information on websites, in books, in reports from an organization. Two of the most common sources that you'll be asked to find for your assignments, though, are going to be articles that are published in scholarly journals and articles that are published in trade publications. And sometimes it can be confusing which is which, so we are going to look for clues to determine whether a source is a scholarly source or a trade source. On this page, you see two covers of publications that are both published related to counseling. The cover on the left is for the Journal of Counseling and Development, and this is a scholarly publication. What you're going to find in here are scholarly articles. The publication on the right is Counseling Today, which is a trade publication. You'll find trade articles in there. Both of these sources are reputable sources, but they're different types of sources, and you might need to use one or the other for an assignment that you're doing. So first, let's talk about scholarly publications. This is going to be the main source of information that you're using in your assignments and papers. Scholarly publications are also often referred to as academic publications or as peer-reviewed publications. And if you're not sure what that word peer review means, all it means is that they've gone through a rigorous vetting process by experts in the field prior to publication. This is more thorough and takes longer than the typical copy editing process that might happen for a newspaper or a magazine. And the peer review process is what confirms that a source is a scholarly source rather than a non-scholarly source. It's not always obvious to determine whether an article is peer-reviewed or not, but there are certain clues that you can look for. First of all, if you find an article in a journal and you think it might be peer-reviewed, usually the journal describes itself as a peer-reviewed journal. So whether you're looking in our library databases, or even if you Google the name of the journal and you pull up the journal website, you should be able to find somewhere that it says it's peer-reviewed. But even just looking at the article that you find, there are going to be clues that it's probably a scholarly source that you found. Usually scholarly articles include an abstract, which is a paragraph-long summary of the study. Usually these studies have reference lists or bibliographies. They'll have footnotes or in-text citations that refer to the sources that the study uses. And as you read through the source, you should be able to tell that it's being published for a specialized audience. So that means that it's going to be using technical jargon for the field. It's going to be referring to specific original research rather than communicating more broadly to an audience. And all of these things are clues that what you found is a scholarly publication. Trade publications are also written for a specialized audience, for instance, the counseling profession. But they don't usually publish original research. And this is the main thing that distinguishes trade publications from scholarly publications. Trade publications also won't be peer-reviewed to the same extent that scholarly publications are. And just like you can find clues for whether a source is a scholarly source or not, there are clues to look for to determine whether a source is a trade publication. Trade publications may have some technical jargon, but they are communicating to a wider audience, so they won't have it to the same extent that a scholarly article will. Trade sources usually won't include abstracts at the beginning of the article or very extensive references either. They might have some references, but not as much as a scholarly journal article. And trade sources are often shorter than scholarly articles, and they're more likely to have images in them or advertising alongside the articles. So these sorts of sources, again, would be things like Counseling Today, which is a magazine, but it's specialized for a field. It's not quite scholarly academic research, but it often is written by academics, and it's usually written for a professional audience. When you are searching for articles in the library databases, you can look for some of these clues to determine whether the source that you've found is a scholarly article or a trade article. So this is a screenshot of a record in the PsycInfo database, and I can tell that this is a scholarly source from looking at a few things here in the record. So the first thing I see is that the authors are listed, and I see that they work at universities and departments of counseling and departments of special education. So this tells me that it looks like the authors are academics and they're probably writing for an academic audience. When I look at the source, it says that it is the Journal of Addictions and Offender Counseling. Often scholarly sources will use the term journal in the title, so that's a good clue there. And I see that it is volume 38 and issue number 2. Often scholarly journals are divided into volume and issue numbers like this. I do see that they have an abstract, the summary of the article there. And then when I look at the bottom under publication type, our databases actually label the different sources based on whether they come from a peer-reviewed journal or not. And if it was a trade publication, you could look down at that publication type and it would say what type of publication it is as well. So by looking at these clues, I have a good sense that when I open this article, this is going to be a scholarly article that I can use as a source. Hopefully this video has given you a better sense of what sorts of sources you can use for your assignments and how to determine whether a source is credible as evidence for the research that you're doing. If you do have any questions though about a particular article that you found or how to find articles related to your topic, please feel free to reach out to me. You can always email me or schedule an appointment on my bookings page, and we can meet to talk more about your research.